Alright, you have now learned quite a bit about different layouts that we can use in Jetpack Compose, but all that knowledge is worth nothing if you're not able to apply it in more real-world use cases. And that is why in this video we'll actually make a real-world, or at least a more real-world-like practice, where we have an existing Figma layout, a Figma mockup here, existing designs with this static UI. So this won't be an actual app that we will build here that really loads such hotel data, but it will all be hard-coded data because the focus here really lies on using Jetpack Compose layouts and making this layout here and this UI responsive with as little work as possible. So you can notice this, if we take this layout and actually resize it, then in Figma we can actually see what this will do and how this should also then behave in our app on varying screen sizes. So here we would have a phone where it would look like this. Then we also have a horizontally scrollable layout here. And if we then extend it again, you can see how the image scales up and everything is just responsive. So the goal is not really on making this pixel perfect here, on using exactly the same spacing values as on Figma. That is usually quite difficult, but it's really on making this a responsive layout. And for that, we will hop into Android Studio, into our basic layout package. And this video, I really recommend you to also follow along and also build this. Maybe if you want, and if you already feel confident with what you've learned here, you can also maybe screenshot this Figma mockup here and build this UI without having followed through the video, and then maybe just watching it as kind of a confirmation whether you did it right or not. But you're also very free in just following along, and I will show you how we can implement this layout and how it's actually a smart way to do that. So let's actually make this maybe a hotel booking screen or so. Make this a file, a composable, in which we start creating our hotel booking screen composable. Then we want to also have a preview for this. So hotel booking screen preview, in which we're going to use our Jetpack Compose masterclass theme. So just that we have access to the theme values. That also comes later in the course, how that exactly works. But then we put in our hotel booking screen in there, and we can start building our UI. We can also launch the preview, so we can already see a blank one. And first of all, let's take a look back at the mockups to see what we actually want to build. What I've, by the way, already done is I have added the static resources that we will make use of here in the drawable folder of my project. You can simply download or copy paste these from the GitHub branch below, unless you want to really use your own icons. That won't have an impact on the responsive UI and functionality here, but you can see I've already added some of them in drawable, which are just XML files. You can either just clone and then copy paste to your Android Studio, or you just copy paste them from GitHub directly. Or maybe I think it's even easier if I just put a zip link here in the attachment section of the video portal, so you can just download these with a single click. Okay, so let's start from the top of the screen and then work ourselves towards the bottom. The top of the screen is this little banner, so it's an image composable, and we want to draw something on top of this. And on what we draw on top of this, we also want to draw something on top of, which is the text. We have some icons with labels, and we have this $420 in night text. So this is the first type of component we will work on here. But even if this is the first type of component or part of this layout that we will work on, we first of all need to think about in what type of layout we want to put this in. So what kind of layout is actually suited for this whole screen as the root layout? And there are now multiple picks that we could debate and talk about. So what would of course be intuitive here is to use a column, because all of these single components like this banner section, these dividers here, the chip section, the description, all of that is just arranged in a column-like layout. And that would work. We could use a column. We could then make the column scrollable in case the screen height is not large enough. But as I already said in the lazy list video, we can also build a lazy list with very different item types, where every single item of the lazy list is a very different composable. So the first item might be our header section, then the divider might be an item, the chip section might be an item in the lazy list. And this of course helps us to only draw what's needed on the screen, so only what's visible. That is why I will pick a lazy column here as the root composable. So lazy column, we can give this a modifier just to make sure we fill the whole size of the screen. And here I would also now make use of the modifier we've passed. So that allows us to just configure this from the outside. We will call this composable as well. So modifier, fill max size, and we want to give this a white background. Something like this. And then on the right side, you can already see we have a blank white lazy column. Okay, taking a look in Figma again, we now want to work on this banner image. So this would simply be an image composable, but we now need to think about, okay, an image composable alone is not enough. We also want to draw this section on top of that, and then also have further components on top of that. And whenever we want to draw something on top of another thing, and also be able to align this, which is pretty much always the case, we need to make use of a box. So that means we can't simply just draw our image here as a plain image composable, but it needs to be put in a box composable. So we go back. And since this is an item in our lazy column, we want to make use of the item block. And in here, we're going to have our box. And in this box, the first item I want to draw is our image, since that is what gets drawn kind of at the bottom of the stack of the box. And here to refer to our image that we added to our drawable resources, so this living room PNG file here, we will make use of a painter resource, and we will refer to r.drawable while importing r. Dot living room. There we go. We can give this a content description of null. That doesn't matter here for a static image. And you can already see our image on the right side. Okay, so the next thing we can work on is the actual faded banner. So this little faded semi-transparent thing that we have on top of here, of this image. And then we simply have our texts inside there. Since this is a composable or a part of the UI that contains quite some nested layouts again, I would like to make this a separate composable function to just get rid of these indentations a little bit and make this whole root screen a bit more readable. So we can call this accommodation or just a hotel faded banner. And if we take a look at that again, then let's think about a certain layout that would work to now have inside of this banner. So we will definitely need to have a layout that we assign this semi-transparent background color. But this layout then also needs to work with these composables and these texts we put in here. And in the end, if we think about this, the way we can model this is simply with a big row. So this faded banner image here, or this is not an image, it's just a background. This faded banner background would be our row that we just give a background color. In this row, we then put a column as the first element here. A column, since we arrange these sections here in a column-wise fashion. And then the second and the third element of this inner column is then again a row. So a row of an icon together with a text, and another row with an icon and a text. And this outer row for this faded banner, the second child, so first child is this column, the second child would be then our price text here, for which we then use the space between arrangement. So this one gets pushed to the right side, and the first element, the column here, will be pushed to the left side. So let's do that. Let's take a look in here in our hotel faded banner. Let's have a row here as the root layout, for which we want to again pass in the modifier that we passed as a parameter here. And we can then give it a background of, let's say, color.white, but we want to change the alpha value a little bit. And the way this works with colors and composes, we can call copy on a color and then set alpha to something like 70%. Let's also make sure to use this composable and call it here in our box where we draw our image. We want to draw this on top of the image, so we use our hotel faded banner here, give it a modifier of modifier fillmax width. If we do this and then also reload the preview, then we should be able to see something already. Well, no, actually not, because the hotel faded banner does not yet have a height, because it does not have any child composables in here. So if we add the very first text, we should be able to see the banner have a very small height. Here we can then pass the text. So Hotel California Strawberry, and the hotel was called like this. And then if we take a look in the preview, we can now notice a very small banner, which is currently displayed at the top of our image. However, if we take a look back on the mockups, it should actually be aligned at the bottom. Since we're using a box, we can just make use of the alignment modifier here by going back and saying the hotel faded banner should now be aligned in the bottom center. Since it fills the whole width of our box, it doesn't matter if we use bottom start, bottom center, or bottom end. But if we pick bottom center, you can see our banner is now aligned here at the bottom of our image, but it's overlapping it. We can then also jump back to the hotel faded banner and style this text a little bit, because this is not how it looked like on the mockups. So we definitely want to make this text bold by changing the font weight to font weight.bold. Then you can see we already have a bold text, and we can also increase the text size, or the font size it's called, to, I don't know, something like 24 sp. We sometimes need to experiment with that a little bit. I think this looks okay, definitely fits here. So let's proceed with that for now. Something I would also like to do is I would like to have a bit of padding here in our semi-transparent area, since otherwise this looks really cramped. We can do this by adding padding here after our background of 16 dp, for example. We can hit Alt-Enter to import this dp value, and then you can see this looks much better already. And I think the font size is actually slightly too large. What if we change it to 20 SP? I think this looks better. But I've already told you that we don't want to actually put this text here as a plain text into this row, because everything else we would now put in here, then that would then be displayed next to this text. So instead what we want to do is, we want to put this in a column and bundle this. So we have our text in the column. Do we need to give this a modifier? Probably not yet. So you can really just put this in a column layout. And below this text, in this column, we now want to have our sections where we display the icon next to this text. So for the favorites and what was that, the location. And every time you actually find something like that, where you have icon, text, so where you find such a kind of reusable schema in your UI, such a reusable component, then it makes a lot of sense to extract that into a separate composable, because then you can reuse that without having to redefine the code over and over again. I think that makes sense. So let's do that. Want to make a separate composable, which we could call, I don't know, maybe a labeled icon or so. So just something that is descriptive. And this labeled icon actually needs a parameter, because it depends what kind of icon we want to show here. This would, of course, now be flexible for us, so we can always pick on a case-by-case basis what kind of icon we want to pass. And the best way to do this is with a composable lambda. So we say we have a composable lambda function so that we can dynamically decide, okay, this is the specific icon composable we want to show for this specific labeled icon. And for another labeled icon, we might want to show a different icon. And then we can pass our individual icon composables to each of these. And in the end, we just want to show this icon now next to the text. So the text also needs to be dynamic here. So we need to pass that in form of a string. And then we simply want to put these together in a row. So we want to display these next to each other, give this row our modifier. It makes sense to also center the elements in this row vertically, so that our text here is actually centered vertically with this icon, which I think it actually isn't here in this mockup. So this is actually the effect we want to achieve here in Compose. So we say vertical alignment is alignment center vertically. And in here, we now really just need to say we want to call our icon composable, so the composable lambda, the flexible icon that we pass from the outside. This is really nothing else than a composable function, just that it's a lambda here, not a real function. And then after that, we show a text composable where we assign our text, so our label. But now we have a reusable component, which you can easily use to show an icon next to a text. So if we now take this, go inside of our column of the hotel faded banner, and we then include our labeled icon. The first one with the text, I need to look it up, Los Angeles, California, and then the actual reviews. So here the text would be Los Angeles, California. And then the icon would now be our composable lambda, so a lambda function here, where we can pass in our icon composable, pass in an image vector of something like icons, default, location on, content description can be null here again. And then on the right side, you can already see that this gets close to how it looks like on the mockups. We also want to tint this icon a little bit, since the color was different on the mockups. And we can do this by assigning a tint attribute here to the icon that we set to maybe color.light gray. Was that it? No, probably dark gray. I think this looks okay. But for my taste, the text is still a little bit too large here. So if we take a look back on the mockups, the title text is quite a bit longer than the label text here. So we can take a look again. Actually not that much longer, but let's just slightly decrease the font size of the text we have here. So font size, maybe 12 SP. Oh, that is too small, maybe 13. I think this looks decent with 13 SP. And then above here in our hotel faded banner, we can just duplicate this labeled icon to have another one of that. And this one here would have the text 4.9 as the ratings. And we say, I don't know, 13K reviews. In this case, we of course want to swap the icon out with something like a star icon, which we also want to give a yellow or an orange. Orange doesn't exist, just a yellow tint, something like that. And that already looks okay, I will say. Of course, these kinds of text here are a little bit cramped. If you've watched carefully here, then you know how we can fix that. We can fix that by giving this column an actual spacing arrangement. So we can say we have a vertical arrangement, and we set this to arrangement spaced by maybe 8 dp. That could look decent. No, I think that's a bit too much. maybe 4dp. I think that looks much better. Cool. So we have the left section of our faded banner, which is now the column that is going around these three texts here. So maybe it helps if we just give this a background color here, just so it highlights this a bit more visually, giving this column a background of color.red. Then you can see this is actually our first element here in our outer row in this faded banner. And the second element will now be a text that we display here and push to the right side with a space between arrangement for this outer row. However, if we take a look back at the mockups and take a look at this price text, you can see that the price text actually consists of two texts, because this one has a different font size than this per night text. And in Compose, there are multiple ways to model this. On the one hand, we could make use of so-called annotated strings, which allow us to just give parts of our text different formattings. So we could make parts of the text bold, we could assign a different font size there, we could color them differently, we could add clickable links. So that is what these annotated strings are useful for. Or if you wouldn't want to use that, you could also put two separate text composables together in a row to align them next to each other here and just give the second text a smaller text size. I think we could actually make use of these annotated strings. That's a new concept. But as I said, either of these approaches would be completely valid. So what we can do is we can go inside of this row. This is now the place we want to put this text after this column specifically. So here we have our text, and you can see this text can now either be an annotated string or a normal string. So far, we've only made use of the normal strings, but we now want to say build annotated string, which gives us a lambda to just visually highlight different sections of the text. And the way this works is we can say something like with style to define a so-called span style. So style is span style, where we can now style the section of the text that we are about to add here in this lambda block. So this section of the text might be in font weight bold. This might have a font size of maybe 20 SP. We also need to experiment with that a little bit. And then in here, in this with style block, we can add or append some text with the append function and say, okay, I want to append $420 and a slash actually. And then you can see on the right, this is now how it looks like. Of course, since we are in the row, it would immediately push this element to the right side of the first element of our column in this case. But we're not yet done with this text. So after this with style, because this is not the style I want to apply for the night section of this text, after that, we can have another with style block with a different style that we define. So we can say span style, and we say, okay, here the font weight should maybe be just semi-bold. And the font size should be smaller, so something like 14 SP maybe. And then we append something again. In this case, it's simply night. And then on the right, you can see that our night text now has a different text size as the other one. Now what we still want to do is we want to push this text to the right side of our screen. So this is our text composable. So what we can do is we can scroll up to our row and give it a horizontal arrangement of arrangement space between. And then our text is being pushed to the right side. We also want the text to be at the bottom of our row, which is the alignment now, so the cross axis. So we can change this with a vertical alignment of this row, and we set this to alignment.bottom. And then our text will jump to the bottom. I think for a phone screen, the text here of the hotel name is still a little bit large. So we could deal with that in two ways now. On the one hand, we could of course go ahead and say we actually decrease the size of our title like this to 18 SP, for example, because then there's also space for possibly longer hotel names. But what now happens if the name is actually much longer? So we also have another strawberry in here. Then you can see this is not really what we expect. This is not what I consider as responsive design, at least. Wouldn't it make much more sense if a longer text would then jump into the next into the next row, so that we would simply have two lines here? Yes, that would make more sense. So what we can say is we have a max lines of maybe 2. But right now, this doesn't change anything. We just say, okay, the text can at max have 2 lines, but this does not change the default behavior of how texts work in Compose. Because by default, the text will just try to get as much space here in our outer row as it can get, without considering the actual measurements and the dimensions of the other composables in there. So what we kind of need here is we need a way to tell the text, okay, up to this point, you can actually expand, but not longer than that. And that works with weights. So in the end, we just want to tell our layout that it should take enough space for the dollars per night text, however much space that might be, but all the remaining space here from this point to the start of our layout, that should be dedicated to our title section. And you've learned how this works. We can go to this column here, to the red one, and say we give it a weight of 1F. And suddenly, it takes all the remaining space that it can get, but it leaves enough space for our $400 per night text. And now you can see the text actually jumps into the next row, which looks decent, but what actually happens if the text exceeds even the second row? Because we set the max lines count to 2. It certainly won't go past that. So if we have even more strawberry text here, something like this, then you can see we have 4 strawberry texts, but we only see 3 here in our layout. So what happens by default is that the text just gets clipped if there is no more space for it. That's maybe also not the best way to handle this, if the user doesn't even know that there is still more text to come. To deal with that, we can work with so-called text overflows. So we can say we have an overflow with which we define, okay, this is what happens if the text does not fit within the bounds of the text composable anymore. And a very common overflow we choose here is text overflow dot ellipsis. If we then take a look, you can see it will simply kind of abbreviate the last text, and that just gives the user a much more visual hint that there is more text to come. If we would increase the max lines count again to 3, then there would be enough space. So in that case, the triple dots would not be appended there, but only if there's not enough space to fit it within these max lines. But let's get rid of all these strawberry texts here again and just have one. That was really just for demonstration, but you always have to account for these kinds of things, that string lengths can be dynamic, can be very long. Especially when it then comes to responsiveness, this is something new to deal with. So let's also remove the background color here, as that was just for visual learning purposes. And then this actually looks quite decent and similar to what we have on our Figma mockups. Let's actually try and see how this would look like on a larger screen now. So we can scroll down, we can actually make another preview. This works with Compose. We just duplicate the preview and say maybe we have a desktop preview or maybe a tablet preview. Let's make a tablet preview. And we say for this preview, we have a different configuration where we say the device we want to preview on is devices Nexus 10. So our 10-inch tablet device. And then if we switch to the preview full screen, scroll down, okay, this is actually not really responsive. So we do see something similar as for our phone. Like here it looks decent, but here, not anymore. We have our per night text here somewhere at the right, but the image already ends. So we need a way to deal with that. So on the one hand, this image should definitely fill the whole width of our screen. This is something it currently doesn't do. But if we do this, you will notice something. If we just go to our layout here and we scroll up to our image, we would give it a modifier of modifier fill max width. If we do this and take a look here, then also really that also isn't really what we are looking for. So it's now centered, and technically the bounds of this image will fill the whole width, but it doesn't change the dimensions of the actual image. And the reason for that is that the image by default just tries to fill the available bounds by taking all the dimensions of the image that we have without actually distorting the image in some way. So if we want to fill the whole bounds of our layout now without the image being distorted, then a trade-off we have to accept is that certain parts of the image will be cropped. So we could of course scale this image up until the left side is here at the left side of the screen and the right side is at the right side. But then certain parts of the top and bottom will be cropped. But this is a very common way to deal with this, and we can do this by assigning a content scale parameter here to the image. And we say crop. If we do this, then the image will now fill the whole dimensions of our screen, but that's also not really what we're looking for. So now it actually says, okay, there's enough width for the image to really fill this whole width, but apparently there's also enough height, so I can just completely draw this image as it is. I don't need to crop anything. But this, of course, doesn't look really well on a tablet device if our whole screen is just image. We want to kind of limit this image. So I want to say you have this much height available, and if you need more height, then parts should be cropped. So what we should do is we can go to our image modifier, and we could give this a height modifier here to always assign a fixed height to this image on all kinds of screen dimensions. But what we can also make use of is this height in modifier, where we can assign a max height, for example, 250 dp. And if we do that, then suddenly it looks much more decent. So you can see on the bottom and the top part are now cropped, but we see the center of the crop part on larger devices. And that's the case because this image would have exceeded the dimensions, would have exceeded the height of 250 dp. But on smaller devices, you can see there are still 250 dp still would fit in this whole image. So you wouldn't need to kind of fix this size. So if this is maybe just 200 dp on a phone, then we don't need to force it to be 250 dp high. And that is what we achieve with the max height. So if we assign height in and then just setting the max value, then it can exceed up to 250 if it needs that. But if it needs less than that, then it will also take less than that and not occupy any non-necessary space. So we should be able to see that effect if we just use the height modifier and say 250. Then in this case, it doesn't seem to make a difference. But if we choose something like 200, yes, then you can see it's actually shrinked. If we choose something larger, like 300 dp, then we force it to be larger here, even if it would already look nice without cropping this image here, at least for phone portrait mode. So let's change this back to something like this. Height in, and there we go. And then our whole image actually fits into this layout. Cool. So that was already the harder part about this layout, but you can see this is now pretty responsive without actually having used any type of window size classes or so to have different layouts, but really just by making use of smart layouts, of using the right arrangements, the right alignments, of using weights. And this is now dynamic and works for all kinds of screen sizes. What we could, of course, think about is that here for a larger device like a tablet, we increase the font size a little bit. For that, we would again need window size classes. So we could go in here in our hotel faded banner and say, window class is current window adaptive info .window size class. And we can then dynamically choose our font sizes of the texts based on the window size class. So we can say here for the hotel title, when window class window width size class is compact, or well, let's use compact first. Then it was 18 sp, so on a phone. If it is medium, we could pick something like 24 sp, and if it is expanded, we pick something like, I don't know, 34 dp maybe, sp actually, not dp. It still complains when expression must be exhaustive. What is missing? I don't know which value is missing. I think we have all these window size classes, but in all other cases, let's just set this to 18 sp. I don't know which window size class is actually missing here. But if we do this and we relaunch the preview, then you can see on tablet devices, we now have a larger title than here on phone devices. So I think this is actually a bit too large, but I think you get the idea how we can achieve this. So let's change this to maybe 28, and then, yeah, that looks better. And the same thing we could then also do for the font size here of our annotated string. Since we have two different font sizes here, we could work with, for example, a font size multiplier, so that instead of working with hard-coded font size units that we use for both of these, we rather say, okay, on expanded devices, the text size is maybe 50% larger than on compact devices. So we can say, well, multiplier, or font size multiplier rather, font size multiplier is, depending on our Windows width size class, for contact, it would be 1F, medium, 1.2F maybe, and expanded 1.5F, and in all other cases 1F. And then we can say we take our font sizes and multiply these with our font size multiplier. And then for our typical phone screen, the text looks identical, but if we take a look here in our tablet, then we actually have a larger price tag here. Cool. Let's go on. The rest is actually not that difficult anymore because we really just put more item composables here in our outer lazy column. So we have a divider, we then have a chip section. You've already learned how this works. We will make use of a flow row for these, another divider, and so on. But let's start with this chip section, for which we can just define some hard-coded tags for a hotel, for example, private val tags. And that's maybe just a list of these tags that we want to have on our chips. So just some perks about this hotel, for example, that it's in city center, that it's a luxury hotel, and a few more maybe, like instant booking, something like exclusive deals, early bird discount or exclusive deal, singular it is, with a luxury replaced with romantic gateway. And lastly, let's have one more, which is 24/7 support. So these are just the text that we want to display on our chips. So we can now go in our lazy column. And first of all, below this box, let's put a horizontal divider. That works with this horizontal divider composable. You can see by default, there is 0 spacing. we can again fix this with a vertical arrangement passed to this lazy column. So vertical arrangement is arrangement that's spaced by 16 dp, for example. And then this would push our spacer, our divider here a little bit to the bottom when we reload our preview. Well, no, actually not. Do you know the reason? Because the horizontal divider is actually put in the same item. So the arrangement and 16 dp of spacing will of course only apply to between two items. So if we take this horizontal divider and put this in its own separate item, then we suddenly get the spacing here. We can also add some padding to it to not make it fill the whole width. I think this looks a bit more, a little bit better. So we can say modifier padding. We just give it horizontal padding of 16 dp. You will see what this will do. It will simply not make it fill the whole width of the screen. Okay, in another item composable, we can now have our chip section. So we can say we use a flow row. You know why? In here, we can say this should definitely fill the whole width of our screen. We want these chips to be centered horizontally. So horizontal arrangement is arrangement spaced by, we give it 8 dp of spacing between each chip, and then also say we center these chips horizontally. So we say alignment, center horizontally. We need to opt into this experimental layout API. So I'll enter here, opt into this, and in this flow row, we just now want to show one chip for every single text that we have in our tags list. So we can say tags dot for every single tag we have here, we want to display an assist chip. Let's leave the onClick lambda empty again, since we don't have any functionality here, but then assign a label text that simply refers to our tag. Something like this. And then you can see there is our chip section. Awesome. Let's go on. After that, another divider comes. We can copy paste this. And by the way, we should also assign some padding to this flow row, because on some screen sizes, it might be that these chips are actually aligned perfectly to the edges, which would look a bit cramped. So if we assign a horizontal padding of 16 dp here as well, then this won't make a difference in this specific preview, but it can make a difference in on screen sizes where these chips actually fit perfectly in a single row. So now we have our other divider here. And after that, if we take a look on the mockups again, we have our description text, which I can actually just copy paste here, because I don't know that from the top of my mind. So we have a single description text that is really just a plain text composable, just like this what we offer headline. Then another section comes. This should actually be scrollable if this exceeds the width of our device. And then finally a button to book this hotel. So below this horizontal divider, another item block where we say we have a text for description. I will use triple quotes here to just make this a bit more readable. It's not really readable, but you get the idea. You can see this is how it looks like. I want to change the font size a little bit of this description to something like maybe 13 SP again, just like our descriptions up here. We want to give this some padding again, so it doesn't start at the very left of our screen. Modifier fill max width, dot padding, and we say horizontal padding of 16 dp, just like the rest of our layout. And then you can see how this looks like. And the text, you can really just use dummy text, or you also copy paste the text from my GitHub repository. That doesn't change anything about the responsiveness of it. Awesome. Below this text, we then have our little heading text that says what we offer. So here, instead of this string, we want to say what we offer. This can be probably the same size as our headline here, which I think was 18 SP. What we offer, there you go. This text should be centered, which we can achieve with text align center. Here we go, and then it will jump to the center of our lazy column. And we also want to have this as a bold text. So font weight is bold again. And there we go. I think maybe we should also center align this description text, because the whole layout is center aligned. I think this would look a bit better by saying text align is either text align.justify. This would also make sense, I think. So then you can see this will just arrange it with the edges of our screen. I think this actually looks decent for a paragraph text like this one. Let's leave that. But below what we offer, we now want to have a horizontally scrollable section. So here, this section for all these little tags, this is now horizontally scrollable. Right now it isn't in a layout like this, but if we actually decrease the size a little bit to a more phone-like dimension, then you can see it doesn't fit here anymore. So we need something where the user can actually scroll. And what can we use for that? To scroll horizontally, we can use a lazy row. So let's have another item composable here and put a lazy row in there. Lazy row, which fills the whole width of the screen, where we say the horizontal arrangement is arrangement center, because everything is centered if there is no scroll bar, if we can scroll, so on larger devices. And then we now need another thing we can loop over just to have these offer items, so just what the hotel offers, which is pretty much just a text and like a text combined with a specific resource from our images here. So this bed, for example. And if we declare a bunch of pairs, well, then we can do this with a map. So we can say val, private val, offers is equal to a map of, and we can say we map our drawable resources here to specific offer text. So the bed one, for example, to our 2-bed offer. So that we have a 2-bed, that we have 2 beds in this hotel room. And we can duplicate this a few times to do this for the rest of our resources. So we have the breakfast offer, then we do have cutlery. We do have paw print, so that we support some pets. We can say pet friendly. We can say serving dish, dinner. We can say air conditioning. What is it? The snowflake icon, air conditioning. We have one for television. We just say TV. And one last icon, which is the Wi-Fi icon. And we map this to Wi-Fi. And now we can really just iterate over all these pairs of this map and say we display this icon together with this text. We want to display these in a column-wise fashion. So the icon first and then the text. So we can again make use of, we could make use of a separate composable here, but this is actually only needed inside this lazy row. So it would also be fine to just declare this inside here. So we can say we have items where we say we use this items overload that takes in a list. We pass in our offers, which is not really a list, but a map. So we can say offers.entries, which is a set of map entries that is still not a list, but we can map this to a list, and then this works. And here we then get references to all these single pairs. So on the one hand, to the drawable res ID and to the actual label. So if we do this, then we have the drawable res ID here destructured as an integer and the actual label as a string. Just make sure you have these parentheses because that matters for destructuring these map entries. And then in the end, we just want to have a column here for every single entry of this lazy row where we can say the horizontal alignment is alignment center horizontally. So we just center everything inside of such an offer item, just like vertically. So we also set this to arrangement center. We can give this a fixed size of, let's say, modifier size 36 dp. Actually, no, this is what I wanted to do for the icon, not for the column, but I want to give this a background color because if you take a look here in Figma, we're now building this component here for these different offer items, which all have this grayish background. So we go in here, we assign a modifier of background color.gray, copy, and we set the alpha value to 30%, and we give it some padding of ATP. In here, in this column, we will then just have an icon composable with an image vector. Yes, if we're drawing an actual vector image, we can use this image vector, and we set this to image vector dot vector resource. If you're drawing an actual image, so real image, a PNG or JPEG, like up here, you need to use painter resource. But if we're drawing a vector graphic, we can use image vector resource and refer to our drawable resource ID here that we iterated over. We can then say we have a content description of null, or we just use the label to describe that a little bit. And this icon now definitely needs some fixed size because you can see otherwise it's super large. So we say we give it a size of 36 dp. Like this, and you can see there are already all of our icons that we see here in our lazy row. We definitely want to have some spacings between these. So we can say we go to our lazy row and not only center these horizontally, but actually also have some spacing. So we can say space by 16 dp and center horizontally, alignment center horizontally. Then you can see this is what this achieves. We now have 16 dp of spacing, maybe rather 8. think this is a bit too much here. I think this now looks decent. Of course, the labels are missing. So in this column here, after this icon, we will have a text composable where we say this is equal to our label. We can also change the font size a little bit to, I don't know, 13 SP again. There we go. And this looks pretty much like on our mockups. If we take a look at the large preview, scroll down here, then we have our centered section, our centered lazy column, a lazy row in this case. And we are almost done with this layout. So if we take a look on the mockups again, the only thing that's now missing is this Book Now button. And for that, we can just use a pre-made composable for a normal button. This would now go in a separate item block again. Item, and we're just using a material button here. Button, on click is blank again. Inside this button's content, you can already see this has the same shape as our button. We want to have a label, so text, that says Book Now. Then there we go, here's our button, which we still want to style a little bit. So here you can see we have this purplish button, which is our primary color. We will get more into theming later, but let's just leave this button at our primary color that we have here in the default theme, which is apparently blue. But we still want to make this a bit larger and center it, so we can set a modifier to modifier, on the one hand, align this here in our lazy column. And we say alignment center horizontally on the one hand. Does that even work? Or do we need to pass that? I think we need to pass this to the lazy column itself, that we just center everything horizontally up here. Horizontal alignment is center horizontally, something like this. Oh no, I'm actually dumb. The button simply doesn't span the whole width yet. So, oh no, okay, probably that does not do it. Maybe this is the reason that we have this invalid import. Yes, now it is centered. So now our button is centered. That looks much better. I still want to give this button a bit of horizontal padding. So we can say modifier padding horizontal, 16 dp. Then you can see this will make it a little bit, actually not wider because the padding is applied here, so that if the button would be too wide, there would still be a little bit of spacing and padding to the edges of our screen. That is why we do this. But to make this button wider, we can make use of width, either using width, and we give it a hard-coded width, like 300 dp. But it would also make sense to make this width dynamic, to just allow this button to scale up a little bit more on larger devices, not to the full screen width, that would look quite ugly, but just a little bit larger. So we can again make use of width in to define a range of widths that we allow for this button. So 300 dp, and we set a max is 400 dp, for example. Then here it won't change anything, but for larger devices, the button might scale up. We can, I think, also enforce this if we actually then say fill max width. So if we do this and take a look here, yes, then it will actually fill all the width that it can get. Since we limited the width with this within modifier, this is limited to 400 dp at max, and therefore this fill max width modifier will then just make the button fill all the width that is fixed here, not necessarily the width of the screen. But I will talk more about that when we come to these size modifiers. We've used these a lot already, but there's more to say about these and how these actually work. You can see this now also exceeds the width for phone devices. So here it's actually not really desired. So we could work around that with window size classes again, or we just leave it because I think here it actually also looks decent. Like on a phone, it's no problem if a button fills the whole width, but on a tablet, this would look quite weird. So in that case, we could also completely get rid of this within modifier and just assign a fixed width of 400 dp without filling the maximum width. Or no, we actually give this a maximum width of 400 dp, but no minimum width. So we say within, because even if we would then increase this to something like 600, which would be way too wide for a mobile screen, you can see this would not be exceeded because the screen width does not give us that amount of width. However, on the tablet device, this larger width would be used. So this is what we achieve with this within modifier. But let's change this back to 400. And then I think this is a good way to deal with that. But if we take a look in here, then this looks pretty much like on our Figma mockups. We can, of course, also now try out this UI on our actual phone or tablet by going to main activity, going in our scaffold, and having our hotel booking screen here. We need to, of course, make use of this inner padding, as you've learned about. Modifier padding, inner padding. And then I've launched my own device here. I am launching the app. And then we should be able to hopefully see something here. And you can see this looks quite weird. The reason is because my device is on dark theme, and we haven't yet explored theming here in this course. When we do, this won't look weird in a dark theme, but we can fix this by actually switching this to light theme, which is the default, by doing this here in our settings at the end, dark theme, turn this off. And then here it looks much better. You can also notice that our button is actually in green, even though in the preview it was in blue, which is also because of our theming and something called dynamic colors, but we'll get to that later in the Material 3 theming section. But what's important is that our layout is actually looking as we expect. So it's not scrollable because everything fits in the bounds here, but here our lazy row is actually scrollable. Very cool. If we rotate our device, then we can also check if this actually looks as we expect. You can see here we can now scroll. Our lazy row is perfectly centered, and we have our Book Now button to book this hotel. Awesome stuff. I hope this practice actually helped you to just internalize all these different concepts taught in this section. Building such composed UI is really just a matter of practice. So keep doing this over and over again. Keep doing more UIs. A perfect place to look for inspiration or for more practices like this is Dribbble.com. So just explore that, find a few cool designs and replicate these in Compose without yet putting focus on actual functionality of the app. That can come later, but really just practice pure UI building. Just replicate existing designs with hard-coded data. So exactly just like we did here.